media language is one of the most influential languages that we have in terms of taking a little event or, a thing that happens in a place and a time, and then broadcasting it out to everybody. So then that interpretation of the event is made the popular interpretation of the event.
Our guest this week is Dr. Suzanne Wertheim.
We're studying the ways that people speak and use language and how it relates to the world around them.
She left her job as a linguistics professor at UCLA in 2011, and since then she started her own consulting company advising lawyers and media companies about how to take bias out of their language, a really tough task. Recently, she wrote an article about how some of the media companies she advised didn't do such a great job taking her advice.
Our brains are incredible pattern recognition machines. And so we take it, it's how we learn language, period, like the grammar. It's how we learn so much of the world around us. Our brains are unbelievable. But what it means is that when we're fed bad data that's disproportionate, then it lodges in our brain.
So how do you know if you're listening to language in the media that is softened or inflated? How does that affect your perception of events?
The president met with congressional leaders. Doctors will start implanting the devices.
And you heard that warning from the Coast Guard tonight.
For now, we're live in Orlando.
For now, we're live in Dallas. We're live in Boston tonight. Caitlin McCulley, 7 News 19.
I'm Caitlin McCulley. I left my job as a TV news reporter in a pandemic to try to find a better way to share stories that matter, no BS. Thanks for listening to Outlet Podcast. You can download new episodes each week.
Here's Dr. Wertheim. So we can kind of just jump in. What drew you to this anti-bias consulting?
So once upon a time, I was a professor of something called linguistic anthropology. And our field has done the worst job of PR because when I tell almost everybody, they're like, what now? Or like, that's so exotic or that's so esoteric. And so I have to explain that basically, are you a person? Do you speak? Do you live in the world? Then we're studying the ways that people speak and use language and how it relates to the world around them. So it's not like esoteric. I think esoteric is like studying naked mole rats or something. I'm like, it's like everyday language in the world all around us. But as I was professoring, I got frustrated by a few things. And one of the things was that I would teach stuff that people would email me years later and be like, Professor Wertheim, I still remember, and stuff I thought was kind of obscure. They're like, it's so useful. It helped me at work. I was dealing with this. And so I started to get really frustrated at all this cool stuff that people were finding useful that was locked behind an academic background. I was like, you shouldn't have to be at an elite university or be able to read an academic journal to get access to this actually really useful stuff. The other thing is there were a lot of students that were leaving the university who've been awesome students. And then they would tell me stories about how the work world was treating them. And it wasn't that good, right? And these were people who were maybe not white or maybe not male. And they went out expecting to be stars like they'd been as undergrads, and they weren't anymore. So that combo is what led me to leave UCLA in 2011 and start my own research and consulting company. And I take the stuff that I used to teach about and research and I apply it to the world. So how can I use my academic expertise to make the world a better and more fair place? And I focus on mostly the workplace, but I also do work with lawyers. And I started working with the media in 2020, and I'm hoping to do more work like that.
So tell me about your relationship to media organizations. I know you said it evolved kind of naturally as you left academia. What are some of the issues that you advise them on?
Sure. So in particular, recently, especially since what people in my world call the Great Awakening, sometimes people call it George Floyd, right? So in May and June of this year in the United States of America, a lot of people's eyes got opened and they started to think about race and violence and fairness and justice in ways that they hadn't before. So suddenly, a lot of media organizations were like, oh, we should maybe, there's always time pressure, right? Everyone's so busy, but they were like, ooh, maybe we should put the brakes a little bit and take some time and space to think about how can we make sure we're doing a good job with our language and we're not being biased in our language. And so they got referred to me and then I advise them. So what I'll do is I'll run an intro training and I'll say, here's my analysis of what the most important issues are. And then I'll also run audits of their output. and give them feedback. So be like, hey, this is really good. Or, ooh, you're kind of hiding who the agent of the action is here, right? Like the way that you're presenting this.
Passive language.
Exactly. You know it. And it's passive language that comes right from press releases, right? And so it's people who have been paid to present things in a way that makes their clients seem as good as possible. And I'm like, ooh, it's your job, sorry, to untwist what got twisted and then take that distortion and flip it and make it so you're reflecting reality again. So that's really what I've been specializing in.
How much of a relationship did you see between this impulse to use passive language or kind of recycle press releases and time constraints, or was there a relationship?
Honestly, I wish I could tell you more. I'm not inside enough to tell you. I did consult with a colleague of mine who is a professor of media studies and a former journalist, right? So I did talk to her. She's in England now, and I'm like, hey, give me advice. And so we did talk about time constraints. I have to tell you, the time frame of academia and producing an analysis is so unbelievably different. You may have an idea for an article and it gets published in a journal 3 or 4 years later by the time it's gone through all the review cycles, as opposed to you go to a thing, right? You go to a place, you figure out what's going on, and you report it within like hours, right? So to me, the time frame of journalism already feels very sped up. But I have to say that the world trains us to understand how things work in a particular way. And so we end up with categories in our brains and ways of seeing the world that let us make snap judgments, make our word choices, make our decisions. And so it's not just speed. We're more likely to make those snap judgments and lose the bias that's coming through when we've got speed. But honestly, it doesn't have to be speedy. You can take your time and still end up with bias because it's been so deeply ingrained, literally since infancy, by how you've been taught to understand the world around you. So I'm giving a pass. That's actually pretty big. And I'm also not giving a pass because media language is one of the most influential languages that we have in terms of taking a little event or, a thing that happens in a place and a time, and then broadcasting it out to everybody. So then that interpretation of the event is made the popular interpretation of the event. And so while I'm giving a pass, I'm also saying to the media, please take the time to make sure that you're doing as well as you can, because you've got such a strong obligation to the world.
And I would think that especially when you have journalists dealing in such tight time constraints, that it would be even more important to make sure they have a foundation of using language that is not biased, so that when they have to make these snap judgments, that's corrected in some way. How do you go about untangling, the way so many people have been raised and their understanding of the world?
I mean, for journalism, what I try to do with the media that I consult with is create a translation booklet, right? Left column is avoid, right column is this instead. So if you're looking, you can just sort of go through. It's sort of like, I think of it, I actually have compared it to like a pilot's checklist. Like every single time a pilot's going to fly a plane, they are walking around the plane and doing the full safety checklist. And I'm like, this is a safety checklist too, right? So, if you have it, the more you can run that checklist, the more you're going to get familiar with it, the more you're going to internalize it, the more you're going to catch it, maybe not as you're doing it, but right afterwards. And so that's really my recommendation is, that there's style guides, right? So every media outlet has a style guide. When do you call someone Mrs.? When do you call someone a woman versus a girl? So if you've got the style guide, that's sort of like bias alert, top 15 things to look for. I think literally every media outlet should have it and be implementing it.
So let's get specific about softening language and what you mean by that.
Sure. So let me just backtrack a tiny bit and say that we are talking to each other because I wrote a post on LinkedIn about a phenomenon that I call softening language. This is my own analysis, my own terminology.
Okay.
In my study of bias, I've learned that I have to coin terms because there are phenomena that I'm like, oh, this is a pattern and I see it. And because other people haven't been studying bias from linguistic anthropology, as far as I know, I'm the only one out doing consulting on bias from the perspective of linguistic anthropology. So it's
Okay.
kind of a heavy burden, but so I find that I have to coin terms because people haven't labeled it before. Once you got a label, then it's a lot easier to see it, talk about it, name it, fix it. But I wrote this thing on LinkedIn where I pointed out, first on Twitter, then on LinkedIn, where I pointed out that the language that was being used to describe what was happening outside the Capitol building and then inside the Capitol building was insufficient in a way that I'd seen again and again in the media, where there are certain kinds of people who are actually violent and dangerous and declare themselves to be violent and dangerous, usually on closed platforms rather than open ones.
Sure.
Here, they were pretty open and still were being described using what I thought, very gentle and soft terms. So it's a distortion of reality where you are taking behavior that's harmful or dangerous or inappropriate. Let's say, like, here's the threshold of inappropriate. Above is inappropriate and below is appropriate. Above is dangerous and below is safe. Softening languages take stuff that's above that threshold and makes it seem either like it's below, like it's safe or not dangerous, or it's close. It's not as bad as it is. So I wrote this post very quickly and said, don't say protests. This is a riot. This is terrorism. Don't say Trump supporters, because there's a difference between somebody sitting at home being like, oh, I wish he'd won a second term, and people going to the Capitol building attempting to overturn in a coup the results of an election that they didn't agree with, right? So I'm like, those are different. So let's reflect the world accurately. That post went viral. And I think it's up to 850,000 views, right? Which is like people, so it really touched a nerve. And so I see that I'm going to have to add this to my list of workshops and media trainings, softening language. And actually, it was part of my media trainings, but so basically it's that. So what we do is we have word choices always. And some of the words frame the world in a particular way. So let me explain this concept of semantic framing, right? So semantic framing is a general linguistics concept that's just out there in the world. And so it's the idea that there are words, usually a noun or a verb, that can trigger a whole scenario in your head. So the example we tend to use is purchase or buy, right? So the word purchase is just one word, but it actually has a whole scenario involved, right? There's the person who's buying, there's the person who's selling, there's the thing being sold, there's money involved. Otherwise, it's like a barter or a trade or a gift. There's probably a location, right? So that's a whole scenario that's being invoked with one word. Well, guess what? That's happening with words like protester or terrorist or protest or riot or insurrection or argument, right? All of these words. So the word that you choose has a framing that comes with it, and it creates a scenario in people's heads. So softening language creates a scenario that is much gentler, much softer, much less dangerous than language that is stronger and reflects reality. And so this is why I felt it was so important. And I tied it to workplace stuff because I was posting on LinkedIn, which is about the workplace. Although very honestly, advising the media is my workplace also, right? So it was like, I'm like, this isn't really about politics. What I'm talking about is language used professionally in the workplace. I see this language again and again and again. And I get brought in all the time. I interview people all the time at companies as like the sympathetic outside person who it's safe to talk to. And I say, what problems are you encountering at work? So I can report to your upper people and say, here are your biggest problems that you need to address, right? And so again and 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 again, this is hundreds and hundreds of interviews I've done, right? People are saying to me, I told them about the problem and then they like dismissed it. They were like, oh, boys will be boys, or they're just so young. They don't know enough. They don't know what they're doing. You need to cut them some slack. When I thought the focus should be, oh, here are people getting literally harassed. I advise lawyers. I'm like, these are lawsuits. These are lawsuits waiting to happen. And you're using softening language to be like, oh, it's harmless. They're just playing. They're so young. They don't mean it. And it's not focusing on the actual harm that's being done.
I liked one thing that you said in your post also. You said the language doesn't have to be exaggerated, just accurate. Do you find that in media coverage in particular, fear-based language, emotionally charged language are common? I mean, that's my perception.
Yes, and I'll tell you that I've stopped watching a lot of media. I, like many people, have now had parents who are older. And so it might involve a blaring TV with news going all the time.
Right.
Right. It's sort of like, oh,
Totally.
come visit in the hotel. And you're like, oh my God, could we please
Turn this
shut
off?
down?
Yes.
Exactly. And in particular, I mean, it was almost always news now that you can get news all the time. And I would find it so exhausting and so challenging and so agitating. And I would be like, the linguist is like, well, what's going on? So I would think about it. So, I mean, absolutely a problem in the media. I mean, media sensationalism is as old as money being exchanged for people bringing news, right? It's just a thing. It's like, get the eyes and keep them, get the ears and keep them, get the, keep them listening, keep them watching. We're very attuned as human beings to danger, right? Like it's one of our top priorities. It's one of the reasons why we have such good peripheral vision. It's lions and tigers.
Right. Goes way back.
It goes way back, but it's like, like you're distracted by the TV in the corner of the room and you can't stop watching it. It's because your eyeballs are trained to be like, oh, is that someone who's going to pounce on me and eat me, right? So we really care about danger. And so I think this is one of the easiest ways for the media to highlight danger in a way that keeps people coming because they're like, oh, it's dangerous. I have to pay attention. And then what you're being fed is so much danger. I think it's just exhausting. And I think it leaves people unable to accurately understand what's going on in the world and make good judgments and think about what they should pay attention to and what they can put down. And let me give you an example also of this. It's more subtle and it's the flip side of softening language. It's an upcoming post. And it's what I call inflating language, right?
Right.
It's the same side of the coin. And so what I see in this country, in the workplace and out in general, is that certain kinds of people have softening language. So they seem more human. We empathize with them more. They're less accountable. And other people have inflating language associated with them. And so here's an example I used in some of my training last year. During Hurricane Katrina, where it was terribly dangerous, it was hard to get food. Water was chest high on me. I think it was chest high on normal height people. I'm very short. On me, it probably would have been like forehead high, right? So there are two photos that circulated a lot of people who had gotten food from grocery stores, right? Wading chest high in water. Photo one, and one was AP and one was a different source, but they're national press photos, right? Mm-hmm. And they're given with captions, as photos are. So they're released to the media. Here's the caption of what's going on in the photo journal. So the official captions that's released nationally to national media and local media is, for one of them, the people are described as finding food in a grocery store. Photo one, people finding food. Photo two, person looted a grocery store. White people were described as finding food, compassionate, humanizing. This is what we might do. The Black man is described as looting the grocery store. Right. So humanization and criminalization. Mm-hmm. And so in particular in this country, we see again and again and again that women who complain about, in particular, sexual harassment or bad treatment there's all kinds of inflating language used to describe them: shrill, abrasive, aggressive, or if they complain of being attacked, they are called all kinds of negative names in terms of sexual availability, right? Mm-hmm. And then Black men, and less frequently Black women who are doing nothing, are described as intimidating, or in the workplace, right? Intimidating, aggressive, angry, scary, when they're just being normal. And then out of the workplace, what we find is they're seen as criminal just for being in a space. So you're sitting in a Starbucks waiting for somebody, cops get called. You're moving boxes into your mostly white apartment building in New York City, cops are called. You're delivering packages in a gated community, and at the gate, you're met by somebody who detains you and cops are called, right? Mm-hmm. So there's all this way. And I think it's this cycle that goes around when the media always is criminalizing and inflating language about the behavior of Black people, which has a long history, which goes right back to controlling people when they're enslaved, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a very long history that goes to a very dark period. And it's a very straight, direct line from 1850s language to 2010s, 2020s language. Mm-hmm. This affects how people see the world, and it affects their judgment. So it's a cycle that keeps on being replicated. And I especially warn the media people I work with to look for inflating language as part of making police seem less accountable, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what we'll do is a Black person will get shot by the police. Suddenly we're learning.
Involved shooting, or, or was shot. Yeah.
Oh, right. Oh, right. So, right. There was an incident where a police officer's gun was fired and a person ended up dead, right? I mean, like, it gets the syntax, it's not just it's not just like, what's the word, but it's the grammatical order of the words also. How much language is used to hide what happened. But we'll also there's so many shootings that I lose track. It's exhausting. But there was a person who was walking back to his car and he got shot in the back like 7 times. And then the reports come out. This is why I'm advising people. I'm like, don't criminalize him. You're going to be pushed. You're going to be pushed. And they did it anyway. I was so disappointed because the police are like, there was a knife under his floorboard. And I'm like, in what world is there a scenario where there's somebody outside a car and he gets shot in the back? What relevance does the knife under the floorboard have, right? So it's that kind of sensationalism and inflating language that they're in line with society. I mean, it's not like, oh, the media is doing this thing that the rest of society doesn't do, but just because it's everybody doing it doesn't mean it's good. It actually just means it.
And especially when you reach millions and millions of people in one sentence. I want to go back to the attack on the Capitol, because you had mentioned in your post that you had advised a media company and that they didn't take your advice. So
that is correct.
What advice did you give and what advice did you see in reality?
So I advised about softening language and hiding danger and hiding agency of action and hiding patterns. Those are the 3 things. I mean, it's hard because you've been trained your whole life to think about language one way. I have how many years of grad school and then how many years of research and teaching, right? So for me, I can look at the world and I see categories and patterns that other people don't see because I've had the benefit of all of these years of training. So I get it that people don't see it. I'm like, that's why I'm out like, how much can I educate? So a bit at a time we can shift. So one thing that happens is very often we will hide, not we, in particular the media, will hide patterns, dangerous patterns, because the story that's fed is that here's red flag, isolated incident. So in particular, this happens with what we call femicide, so murder of women and girls, right? So there are some age groups where being murdered is one of the leading causes of death for female people in the US and in the UK, right? One of the leading causes of death. But what you'll find again and again in the police statements and in the reports is that someone's body is found in the woods, she was running, and then they find the person. It's like it's an isolated incident. Like you're supposed to feel safe, right? But nobody's actually saying, nobody's looking at the numbers. There's this minimization.
Right.
Nobody's saying, nobody's saying this number of women are murdered a year, or this number, like fake phone numbers exist for a reason, right? And sometimes men are like, oh, fake number, it's like, that's so terrible. And it's like, so you don't get murdered when you say no, because there are women who say, no, I'm sorry, I don't want to give you my number. And then they end up dead. And I honestly can't find the numbers. I do a training for lawyers. I do training for lawyers, right? Mm-hmm. And I look for the numbers to give them because I'm talking about the dangers of saying no. I'm like, you can't argue that somebody said yes just because they didn't explicitly say no. Here's why it's dangerous to say no. So I know that the media doesn't really have time, but I find it very exhausting when people say lone wolf and people say isolated incident, and they are both about generally men who are being publicly violent, right? And I get very exhausted by and angry by, especially the lone wolf idea that, or the humanizing of very often attractive white men. They're young, they're good looking, and they went and killed a bunch of people, right? Mm-hmm. And there's all this humanization where we're told their histories and we're told their stories, and we look into their struggles and all of this stuff that goes on. And it's like, is that the amount of attention should be paid? Why aren't we paying more attention to online radicalization? This absence of going that one step deeper and seeing where the patterns are. And the fact that, like, for example, Kyle Rittenhouse, 17, was on Facebook, saw a call to arms. There are these protests. Let's go put him, whatever the terminology was. It was very inflaming. And by the way, not just media, but social media. Social media
of course
has been reprehensible in terms of allowing hate speech and violence incitement to foment on their platforms. So, and he went and he took a gun and he crossed a state line and he murdered 2 people, right? This is someone who I think should have been at home, like playing a video game. And instead, so those absences of showing the links means that we minimize the danger in our own minds because the media hasn't done the work. Journalists haven't done that work to show us. And people are so busy, and now the pandemic, right? Like being outside is scary no matter what. So who has the time? It's like, how am I going to get food? How am I going to make money? You know, people are concerned. Well, if the media isn't doing that work to show these aren't isolated incidents, this isn't a humanized person where we should think, oh, this one nice guy, so handsome, so pleasant, like this fascination with Ted Bundy. I'm very tired of hearing about Ted Bundy. What I'd like to hear about is ways that we can do a better job of preventing violence against women and murder of women. So, which I know sometimes I think it's interesting. People are like, oh, makes you so liberal and it makes you so, you're so lefty, you know, like, I think it's interesting that literally just saying, I would prefer it if fewer women were raped and fewer women were murdered has been characterized as some kind of weird or marginal or outrageous thing, when I think it should be very central to our society.
Absolutely. Well, and you made me think of something too, you know, when we're talking about people charged with crimes and coverage of that before they're convicted, or if they're not convicted, in the initial phase, people charged with crimes, that is what the viewers and readers remember. And then even if it turns out they weren't convicted, you know, most people aren't going to remember that that they are innocent. And so do you see the same thing with language that's used? Like if an organization changes how they're framing it or whatever, the initial reaction and response to what was originally reported sticks with people more?
You read an article, you read a headline, and then 3 days later in the correction column, you know, the Chinese, who like you might not even see it, or there's the tiny headline. So in my post, I talked about softening language, talking about sex crimes and sexual assaults is very, very common. And I gave the example of Ghislaine Maxwell, who is often described as sourcing girls and trafficking. Not trafficking, sorry, sourcing girls who are abused, when we don't really get to the actual language of the indictment, right? So the actual language involves phrases like sex trafficking and rape, right? And so that's the more accurate thing. So that softer language, it can be very, very hard to talk about sexual assault and sex crimes. So it makes sense that generally people won't talk about it. And so you remember the way it was phrased at first. So the example that popped to mind was Mary Kay Letourneau, for people who are of a certain age, died last year as I was running these media trainings. And so I noted how she was described. And so she was described in ways like, I think one headline was like, Mary Kay Letourneau, who made headlines for her relationship with an underage student, dies. Right? So I used this as an example because I was like, it's so softening and it's so masking of what she did. And I was like, Mary Kay Letourneau, who was convicted on 2 felony counts of child rape, dies, right? So she was young and pretty and sympathetic and white. So all of these are reasons why there had been that softening language in the first place. But even years later, when we know what she did, that first characterization sticks. So I would say it's true on both ends. When it's inflated or inaccurately inflated, it sticks. And when it's inaccurately softened, it sticks, as long as it's in line with the social stereotypes that support the softening language and the inflating language.
Which do you think is more dangerous?
I don't know. That's a bad choice. Let me think it through for a minute. I mean, right now, so here's recency bias, right? Okay. Recency bias is a thing that the stuff that just happened like looms. So that's like, it affects your decision-making so much. So right now, what I really want to say, and I think I'm probably going to stick with it, is that softening language is more dangerous because it's hiding danger, right? So if you have sympathetic people, like let's say you've been accused of a crime and then it doesn't happen, like you can get another, like change your name or you get another job and you say to people, I wasn't, like, you know, and so it might take you a little longer, but you can get back to normal life. But when we're hiding again and again and again patterns of danger that end up with people dead, I think that's more dangerous. Oh, I have arguments to the contrary, but I'm going to stick with that one because that's where I'm at right now. I am more afraid of white men with guns than anything else. And very honestly, when I was a professor on campus, I felt safer as soon as I left campus, because I was teaching about bias in different ways, right? And so I could be seen as, I don't even know. I mean, I'm okay to be called feminist, right? But there are some people whom feminist is considered a bad word. And
Right.
so college campuses are sources of violence where people who are angry at people like me sometimes go and shoot them. I mean, there was knifing on my own campus a couple of years after I left, right? And Santa Barbara had somebody who was angry because he didn't have a girlfriend, had been radicalized online and went around and murdered a bunch of people who were all female, right? So to my mind, the dangers that radicalized white men in this country present are known in the security community. They're known in specialized communities, but they're not as widely known as they might be. And so it stops people from maybe doing early alerts or paying attention to early alerts the way that they might if they were already prepared with the knowledge of the levels of danger and had the right categorizations in their head that they could use to make judgments. So, like, you know, the Nashville bomber.
We saw over and over again media outlets that were offering him the courtesy of the backstory and the humanization.
So first of all, yes, backstory. And this, here's the problem with semantic framing. Here's the softening. Who are terrorists? I would like accurate use of language where there are predetermined criteria, and then we apply language in the same way, even if it's person A who has one kind of identity or person B. It's the criteria that matter, right? And so I see problems with this again and again. So terrorism in many people's minds is linked with 9/11, is linked with dark-skinned people, is linked with Arabs. But in fact, domestic terrorism, I was just reading, I think is responsible for domestic white supremacist terrorism was responsible for 70% of violence in the US in the last year or two.
Yep.
Right. So it's this enormous problem that people are not paying sufficient attention to. And so the thing I was going to say about the Nashville bomber is not just all of this courtesy and an unwillingness to use terminology that is appropriate according to the predetermined criteria. There's this unwillingness, especially by people, well, he looks like me. So somebody who looks like me can't do bad things because I'm a good person. So I can't do, you know, I wouldn't do that. So someone who looks like me wouldn't do it. Only the other people far away or other people in different groups do that. But they also didn't listen to his girlfriend, the police. So she went in 2019 and said, my boyfriend is building bombs in his RV and I'm worried about him. And you know what the follow-up was? Zero. So I wonder if we were doing a better job of not using the softening language and educating police departments and the media and other places, that the police would say, oh, this kind of public violence by white men is really on the rise. And it's really a big problem. You know, the biggest one was Oklahoma City all those years ago, right? And that's a pattern of behavior that's been happening again and again. And there are still people who don't connect the dots because they haven't been connected for them. And so who knows how much better the outcome might have been. It's not as dramatic to prevent a bombing and a crime, but I like those outcomes a lot better than figuring it out afterwards. So
Absolutely. Yeah. For people watching the news and reading the news, what are some cues for them that they are hearing softening language or they are hearing inflamed language, and how can they go about reframing that for themselves when they talk about it or see it in other news sources?
I mean, it's a really good question. I like that question. I wish I had like what I find again and again in my training and in my consulting is that people want the list of do's and don'ts, right? Like,
Sure.
here's the do and here's the don't. And I'm always like, especially I work in tech a lot and there's a lot of engineers. And I'll say right up front, I'm like, hey, you're probably coming to this training being like, yes, I'm going to get a list and I can program the list and then I've got it, like, here's what to not do and here's what to look out for and here's what to do. And I'm like, unfortunately, language is so complicated and it's so situational and it's so contextual. So I would love to be like, here are the top 5 words that let you know you're listening to a sensational thing. I don't have it. I've tried to do it and I failed. Here's one thing I will say that's a little easy to find. So there's some surface level stuff that we can pick up pretty quickly. And then there's other stuff that we don't really recognize, maybe until retrospect, or it just flies under the radar entirely. Above the radar, I think, is superlatives. So if there's like the best, the worst, like highlighting how extreme something is without supporting data, right? Like I wish I'd made a stamp. How many hundreds of student papers have I graded where I wrote laboriously, do you have evidence to support this claim? Like I almost made it in a little stamp so I could just do it, right? You have evidence? And I felt the same way when I do audits on media stuff. I'm like, do you have evidence to support this claim? Like what, like you're saying this thing is like if you're going to say something is like an end point, you better tell me why. So I think that's one of the things. I think I was finding last summer that I did not love was a mismatch between a photo and the words that the photo or the footage was being used to illustrate.
Okay.
So for example, especially earlier in the pandemic, I would see pandemic news illustrated again and again and again with pictures of East Asian people, right? So there was a headline like pandemic affecting Wall Street, and then there's a picture of people in Hong Kong, right? So there's this thing. And so there was a lot of ways that the media was stoking up the idea of who can we blame? Pandemics are scary, and it's hard to blame an invisible virus, right? And it's hard to blame when you show up symptomatic 14 days later, it's hard to figure out probably who infected you. So it's hard to blame. So the cycle of blame is hard. So it's much easier to have a far away, maybe enemy who isn't that far away. So where I am, it's there's a very high East Asian population in San Francisco and in Oakland and in Berkeley. And there were lots of reports in the Bay Area of all kinds of violent things that were being said to people because of these different kinds of presentation that were meant to highlight the danger coming from Asian people, which were, by the way, also coming from the executive office. So it wasn't just the media. I would say also look for, you knew the passive right away. You jumped on passive even before, because as a news reporter for so long, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've been trained and then it shows up anyway. So there is not just, okay. So think about it. It's very hard to do in the moment, but if you don't know who did the thing, right? What I see all the time is the disguising of who's the agent of the action. If you don't know who did the thing and what the thing was, then it's hard to trust this portrayal of the thing that happened, right? Mm-hmm. So there are these incredibly convoluted, very long sentences that I use in training to show that are very real things that came from generally police press people and spokespeople that are like a gun went off, like who
was discharged. Yeah.
What was discharged. And you can rewrite it as very briefly, like last night in a parking lot and blah, 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 a police officer shot so-and-so, pronounced dead on the scene, right? Like it can be, so if you're hearing a lot of very complicated passive words to hide the action, maybe it's time to look and be like, well, what are they hiding and why? And then definitely the softening language and the inflating language. So a lot of people in my LinkedIn post are very angry that I did not use the word terrorist and riots to discuss the BLM protests of the summer in particular.
Yeah.
And I spent a lot of time researching them, what professors of media studies have written about, like how do protests get covered, if people go and talk to the protesters, if people don't, to show distortion in the media and what happens. And so, for example, if journalists don't talk to protesters, the chance that the protest is called a riot or violent go way, way up. And the perspective of the protesters isn't given, right? So there are all kinds of distortions that happen. And what I saw in the media again and again and again was an inflation of almost completely peaceful things. And so highlighting only the one thing that happened that may not have been by a protester. There were a lot of bad faith people who infiltrated and did them. I'm not saying it excuses everybody, but there are a lot of things where you highlight the one terrible thing. And if they say thousands of people protested and then they show one person doing a bad thing and you don't see the rest of it, that should trigger your skepticism muscles. What very often will happen is the semantic framing changes depending on who you are and what your perspective is. What's being described as a protest, what's being described as a riot. So if the problem is when there's omission, how's the average viewer going to tell, or the reader?
Yes. Well, and that's the other issue with the Black Lives Matter protests. And I addressed this in a newsletter that I sent out on Sunday, is that, we know from research that 93% of them were peaceful out of 7,800 something that was tracked by this research organization. But the additional problem is that many of the peaceful protests in towns and cities, they didn't make the news because they're not, you're not going to keep people's attention with that, especially, on the national stage, or you're seeing the controversy, the violence, the whatever that they're showing. And so I think that also affected people. That may explain some of the reaction you're getting on your LinkedIn post too, is that people are just, they haven't seen what many reporters have seen. We've covered them, but we got the call. We don't need you. We don't need you live.
It's not going to bring the viewers in. It's not dramatic. It doesn't make beautiful footage. It's not. And so, well, that's the thing about our brains are incredible pattern recognition machines. And so we take it. It's how we learn language, period, like the grammar. It's how we learn so much of the world around us. Our brains are unbelievable. But what it means is that when we're fed bad data that's disproportionate, then it lodges in our brains, right? So if you're being fed again and again, like you can hear peaceful, but if you see violence, problems, blah, 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 then your brain is making what seems like a reasonable judgment, right? And so it's this constant battle between what makes interesting journalism and what makes responsible journalism. And the problem is that in all kinds of subtle ways, just how much is shown. I mean, I get exhausted with, I've said exhausted a lot. I'm obviously very tired.
We don't blame you. We don't blame you.
I'm so tired. I just wanted a nice, quiet ramp up to my new work year. I was just like, I'd taken a few weeks off and I'm like, reorganize the office, clean up the computer, do the stuff. And as of Thursday, I'm like, like Wednesday, all of this stuff. So when my parents would run news shows, I'm like, they're still covering this thing. Like the other thing is the top stories will be rammed home again and again and again.
Over and over.
And so there's this thing called implicature we talk about in linguistics, where the implication, if something takes up a lot of space or a lot of mental space or language, that it's important, right? We talk a lot about important things and we talk very little about unimportant things. And so even just the fact of having the same story repeated again and again tells our brains, this is important. We have to pay attention to it. This is dangerous. We have to put our attention to this. And then other stuff that's more normal or also should get attention, but is less sexy to put on TV, gets pushed to the side. I'm thinking, when I was in grad school, I moved from Berkeley to Oakland because it was cheaper. And the first winter break that my parents visited, they had been so freaked out. They're like, because the news reporting in the 90s of Oakland was not good. It was just like murder, 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 danger, danger, danger. And so I took them on a tour of like shishi, bougie Oakland, right? And so they'd be like, we're having like outdoor cafe lattes. They're like, where are we? I'm like, Oakland. They're like, I'm taking them on a hike in a magnificent hill park. Where are we? We're in Oakland, walking around a lake, taking a little sailboat in a mini lake, and I kept on saying, this is Oakland. And finally they were like, we had no idea Oakland was like this. I'm like, because it doesn't make news. people did middle class stuff in Oakland today. They enjoyed nice weather and took a stroll and went to a farmer's market and ate delicious food. Like, that isn't newsworthy. And so later on, when I learned more of the stuff about brain inputs and how we create cognitive categories, I was like, oh, the media had only, like, it's not newsworthy to point out all the nice quality of life stuff that happens in Oakland for a lot of people.
Where do we go from here? Do you think that media organizations will go against their best interests sometimes in using accurate language instead of inflamed language? Do you think that's possible?
I think it's possible, but I'm not optimistic, right? So I wonder, every time something very major happens in this country, there's talk of it's a day of reckoning, or I hear things like, this is not us, this is not who we are, right? And to be very honest, I hear that from people who belong to groups that have been safe for a long time, right? So they might be immigrants or descended from immigrants, but they're not subject to the dangers that happen to certain sections of the American populace. So these are people that I talk to a lot. I myself have faced, for people who can't see me, I am technically white, but I'm just dark skinned enough to trigger a lot of "what are you" questions, or "where are you from," or "who are you?" You're so exotic. Since infancy, since the incubator at NYU Medical Center, where I was born in the US, people have wondered where I was from, right? Literally in the incubator. So I have personal experience also of people talking about what it's like, and how this is not us. But for a whole segment of the American population, this has been America for a very long time, right? I've done a lot of work, not a lot of work, I wish. I've done a decent amount of volunteer work with Native Americans in California on getting their languages documented and bringing them back into more use. So I've spoken to Native Americans more than many people who live in cities where people think Native Americans don't exist anymore, right? And I grew up in very white suburbs, but over time, I've gotten more diverse groups of friends. And so I talk to people and I hear their life stories, and they're very different from mine, and they involve not being safe, right? So this country was founded in very dark ways, right? It involved stealing land from people and putting them in tiny locations and pretending they don't exist anymore, and denying them sovereignty. It involved kidnapping people and bringing them over and having them in brutal conditions to generate wealth for other people, forcing them to lose their languages, forcing them to lose their names. Those legacies are not really talked about that much, almost never. They're hidden over in textbooks. Oh my God, softening language in textbooks. I wish I could find the exact phrase, describing enslaved people as they came to work on plantations.
I did a story on that. I did a story on that in Houston. There was a textbook that I think they described enslaved people as servants.
Yeah.
And it was in a textbook, in like a 7th grader's textbook.
Yeah. Right. So that's the most softening and masking language. It's hiding what's going on. So we don't ever like to think of ourselves as bad people. We don't like to think that we might have done bad things. We don't like to think that we might be benefiting from unfairness that was put in place by other people, but still makes some people's lives easier and some people's lives harder. And so softening language, we can use it on ourselves too. So we like a mistake or a missed opportunity, or things that maybe we should have stepped up and done something to prevent an unfairness, or fix a situation we didn't do, right? And so I think it's really so much work that's involved that I do hope that this latest day of reckoning on January 6th, 7th, I've already lost track. January 6th. This latest day of reckoning may be shocking enough to change people's behavior and say, what role are we playing? But I think until there are consequences that are very painful, or just painful enough for people who use softening language and inflating language, until there are consequences for people who are violent and get away with it because they belong to certain groups, until there is real accountability, it's hard to, I think, have enough pressure on the media. And the other thing is that with this fracturing of news sources and media sources, I think people really do like to find their way to the stuff that reflects their worldview. And so I think reflecting the world more accurately is good for people, but it's like, I'm trying to think of a good food people don't like broccoli versus potato chips. Potato chips are engineered, there's so many snack foods that are engineered to be addictive, and they are terrible, terrible, terrible for your body. And then by contrast, when you eat like a regular food that your body's like, hey, I'm really excited, you're not excited to eat it. And I feel like a lot of media has been engineered in the same way to be very addictive, but not good for you. And then the good for you media is like broccoli and olive oil. It's like,
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I would like to play a role. Periodically, people who know me will tweet. I'll open up Twitter and there's media. Like, I'm like, what are these mentions? And people are like, hey, New York Times, you should be hiring Suzanne Wertheim. Hey, like, this is terrible. Like, you need help. But none of, like, they don't
really want it.
No, they don't really want it. It's like nobody has ever, for all the times that's happened, no media outlet, besides the ones that have made an internal from the top decision to work on debiasing their language. Nobody else, even with egregious mistakes, has reached out to me for help. How can we prevent being inaccurate this way? How can we do better? So yeah, I'm not optimistic, but it's my life's work to educate and do what I call harm mitigation. How can I make the world a little bit less bad, one piece at a time? So I'll keep on doing it till I'm not doing it anymore. So.
All right. There's some optimism.
Well, every shift for the better is a shift for the better, and eventually the tipping point.
All right. I sure appreciate your time. I know I've taken more of it than I said I would.
Not a problem. This is among the most important things that I can be doing with my time. I'm delighted to do it. Could not be more delighted.